Now I present our first speaker of the second session, Scarlett Martin. Scarlett Martin is a professor of contemporary philosophy at the University of São Paulo, having formed several generations of researchers. She's also the founder of the Nietzsche Study Group, GEM. Besides publishing articles and books and specialized journals around the world, she has published 18 books, including Nietzsche from the Cosmic Force to the Human Values, a work that became a landmark of the Nietzsche research tradition in Brazil. Scarlett will soon release a book in France that will probably be entitled Nietzsche's Ambivalence, Types, Images, and Female Figures by the prestigious Éditions de la Sorbonne. And the theme of this new book, Nietzsche and Women, is also the theme of her presentation here today. So please, Scarlett.
Good afternoon, good evening. I thank very much Eduardo Nasser for his words and for the organization of this workshop. I'm really very glad to have the opportunity of discussing with my colleagues. Instead of presenting a text according to the format expected for this occasion, I prefer to bring you an overview of my next book. Nietzsche's reflections on women have long aroused the reservations because of the misogyny that was considered to be present in his texts and the anti-feminism which was believed to be detected there. To examine the theoretical questions raised by these reflections, or to think about their place in Nietzsche's entire corpus, was not topical. It seemed more prudent, apparently, to ignore his positions on women. Among the commentators who have nevertheless taken into account his writings on that matter, some argued that they did not match his talents or simply were devoid of philosophical interest. Recently, Nietzsche's remarks on women have been examined in several texts that are particularly relevant to feminist studies. In general, they adopt two different ways of proceeding. Either they discuss how to evaluate his observations on women, or they consider the possible contributions of the Nietzschean thought to feminist theories. There is no shortage of works on Nietzsche's provocative writings on women. However, in my view, there is a lack of scholarship dedicated to dealing with the philosophical structure which supports them. Certainly, examining Nietzsche's texts on this matter is not an easy task. His writings present a plethora of remarks ranging from cliches to a complex and refined analysis of the human condition, or from scattered digressions to conclusions resulting from detailed argumentation. With the exception of his first texts, his reflections on women can be found throughout his work. For example, in many aphorisms of Human Auto Human, in a sequence of paragraphs of the second book of the Gay Science, in several speeches of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, in a group of paragraphs of Beyond Good and Evil, and in some passages of the Twilight of the Idols. Taking into consideration both his published books and his posthumous fragments according to their chronological order, I attempted to make an immanent reading of Nietzsche's texts with the purpose of clarifying the positions he takes on women and at the same time shedding light on the strategies he uses. Examining the images of women that Nietzsche builds and the roles he assigns to them, studying the way he uses typology in his analysis of female figures, raising the question of why he creates female personifications of abstract entities, inquiring the positions he assumes towards women who want to emancipate themselves, understanding the reasons which lead him to fight head-on women authors. These are the problems that I will take as a guiding thread of my investigation. I argue that, far from occupying a marginal place in his work, representing sporadic digressions or being limited to personal preferences, Nietzsche's writings on women are closely connected to his philosophical enterprise. With regard to women, Nietzsche subverts philosophical tradition which hitherto rarely considered sexual differences as an object of study. By distinguishing masculine and feminine, he initiates a discussion about the human relations which could be referred to as sext. The first question we have to address, therefore, is the way in which he conceives sexual differences. Nietzsche would hardly view sexual differences as mere biological distinctions. This is primarily because he denies the opacity of facts, he rejects the supposed objectivity of science. However, it is also the case that Nietzsche does not conceive the masculine and the feminine as mere cultural constructions. If he were to merely deny biological differences in favor of cultural constructions, he would espouse an interpretation of the human being just as partial and weak as the one he criticizes. We can say that as cultural constructions, the various historically situated conceptions of feminine and masculine are detected by the physio-psychological condition of individuals who belong to a certain social group in a given moment. However, since the values established by these individuals are incorporated in some way or another into their physio-psychological condition, they end up transforming it. Thus, in their various expressions, masculine and feminine become a second nature, which is also constantly changing. By establishing a close relationship between physiology and typology, Nietzsche presents several female types, among them mothers, spinsters, and emancipated women. These types could very well be embodied by women with whom he related during his life, Franziska, Elisabeth, and among others, Malvida von Meisenburg. Nevertheless, I argue that turning to Nietzsche's biographical details is not of a great help in elucidating his philosophical positions. The task of pointing out the presence of various women in his life serves no purpose to shed light on the female types he conceived. Of course, Nietzsche was also a prodigious author of writings concerning his own life. But the relationship between life and work, in the case of Nietzsche's thought, should be approached with caution. In my view, he does not put his existence to one side when creating his work. Rather, his work is an integral part of his life. That life was necessary for that work to exist. But that life cannot be reduced to an individual psychological configuration or a specific inner world. But let us leave Mr. Nietzsche. What is it to us that Mr. Nietzsche has got well again? One can read in the preface to the second edition of the Gay Science. Singular, the experiences of the author of the book are not individual. His texts express a certain form of life, a specific physio-psychological condition. It doesn't seem unreasonable to say that, using Nietzsche's biographical details in an attempt to explain his work, instead of providing solutions, only generates new problems. Certainly, he was ambivalent with the women he encountered during his life, like in his relationship with Lou Salomé and Cosima Wagner, and especially with his sister and his mother. It is also true that more important ambivalences appear when one compares how he treats emancipated women in his texts and his behavior towards those with which he had a relationship. However, what I'm primarily interested in are the ambivalences found in Nietzsche's own texts. In Human, all too human, the first ambivalences towards women appear. According to Nietzsche, on the one hand, incapable of taking the reins of their own life, women put themselves at the service of others and conforming to the idealized images conceived by their lovers are nothing more than simulacra of women. On the other hand, because the maternal figure plays a decisive role in the image of the woman constructed by men, and because women behave maternally in relation to their lovers, they are responsible for the attitudes towards them assumed by their lovers. On the one hand, to begin with, women idealize love, but once they get used to the idealized images they have created, they become trapped by their own idealizations. On the other hand, both with regard to their children and their lovers, women merely seek to exercise power over men. On the one hand, in the framework of a successful marriage comparable to the friend, the woman provides her spouse with moments of intense intellectual pleasure. On the other hand, respecting social rules, she constitutes an obstacle to him becoming independent in his thoughts and actions, and thus prevents the emergence of free spirits. Although Nietzsche considers that women can contribute to the education of the generations to come in Human, all too human, he still entitles this chapter Woman and Child. Putting the two nouns side by side, he implies that the woman has the same condition as the child in the social context. Neither of the two can be equal to the man. He also shows that the field of activity of the woman is restricted to the home. She is responsible for accompanying his husband and caring for the children. It is only in the gay science that the close relationship between Nietzsche's philosophical enterprise and his reflections on women clearly appear. In the sequence, which begins with paragraph 57 and ends with paragraph 75, Nietzsche brings to light two convictions which constitute the very nucleus of dogmatic philosophy: the belief in objectivity and the propensity to anthropocentrism. At the same time, he opposes realists, he reveals his own positions. Of course, most of paragraphs present in the second book of the Gay Science concern artists, and on this point, I agree with Sebastian. On the other hand, in my view, this sequence of paragraphs about women is closely connected with many features of Nietzsche's philosophical enterprise, including his gnoseological considerations, such as his critique of the idea of subjectivity. So, I was saying, at the same time that Nietzsche opposes realists, he reveals his own positions. Insofar as one of the central features of his philosophical enterprise consists precisely of putting an end to the primacy of subjectivity, Nietzsche does not accept the idea that objectivity consists of a disinterested, neutral, and impersonal way of seeing. Since his philosophical enterprise intends to conceive the human being as a part of the world and not as a subject in the face of reality, Nietzsche cannot accept the idea that human beings consider themselves as the center of the universe. A careful examination of the sequence of paragraphs of the second book of the Gay Science enables us to detect and bring to light a structure comparable to one present in another sequence of paragraphs, that which begins with paragraph 230 and ends with paragraph 239 of Beyond Good and Evil. Then, in Beyond Good and Evil, in order to address women's emancipation, Nietzsche chooses metaphysical conceptions as his target of attack, and opposing them simultaneously presents one of the essential features of his philosophical enterprise, that is, to translate humanity back into nature. In the sequence of paragraphs of the Gay Science, when he deals with women, Nietzsche turns to the realists and criticizing them proceeds in the same way. His attempt to animalize and naturalize human beings is present in the demand to consider their drives, their passions, and their affects. It's from this perspective that Nietzsche considers women in the Gay Science. Rejecting the idea of woman as such, he refuses to see the woman as an essence. By the same token, he makes it possible to conceive of a plurality of configurations of the feminine and take each of these in its singularity. For their physio-psychological conditions, he defines different types of women. However, this does not prevent new ambivalences in relation to women from arising in this book. In the preface to the Gay Science, seeking once more to distinguish himself from dogmatic philosophers, Nietzsche identifies truth with a woman. In his view, being a woman, the truth knows very well that the truth pursued by dogmatic philosophers does not exist, for she is not this truth they believe to exist. In other words, the truth, which is a woman, considers as an affront the doctrinal truth dogmatic philosophers pursue. With her veils and adornments, she puts herself out of their reach. With great modesty, she operates on a different record. While he identifies truth with a woman in order to attack the conception of truth adopted by dogmatic philosophers, Nietzsche praises, along the same lines, the woman that refuses to succumb to them. This new conception of truth Nietzsche calls bubble. It should be remembered that the preface to the second edition of the Gay Science was written in 1886. At this point in his intellectual career, Nietzsche believes that his greatest task is to carry out his project of transvaluation of all values. Transvaluating values is, above all, first, suppressing the ground from which the values were hitherto engendered. It is also, second, inverting values, valuing everything which was previously feared by humankind, and devaluing everything that was previously venerated by it. Moreover, the third aspect, it is creating values which are in consonance with the body, with the life, with the earth. If you take into account the second aspect of the project of transvaluation of all values, it's possible to understand that the new conception of truth, which Nietzsche has in mind, refers to the unveiling to the human being of everything which was hitherto forbidden, an unveiling so aptly represented by Balbo's indecent gesture when she lifts her purples and displays her genitals. If we take into consideration the third aspect of the Nietzschean project, we can also understand that this new conception of truth refers to the creation of values which take the human being as a physio-psychological configuration. A figure of fertility, Balbo's gesture, can be interpreted as an incitement to sexual activity. She draws attention to the importance of the body, the life, and the earth. Thus, Balbo designates an image of the woman which is entirely in consonance, entirely in tune with Nietzsche's philosophy itself, a positive image of the woman. But it is also true that this woman never existed. While Nietzsche does not abstain from criticizing human all too human women, he insists on expressing his esteem for those who only exist in the imagination. It is in Thus Spoke Zarathustra that the mismatch between female personifications of abstract entities and the human, all too human women reveals itself clearly. Nietzsche identifies the woman with solitude, which reaches with solitude, which teaches him about abandonment, and happiness, which chases after him. But it is especially wisdom, life, and eternity, which conceived as women, will play a central role. Zarathustra becomes an accomplice of wisdom, dances with life, and declares his love to eternity. There is no doubt that these are his beloved women. In this book, Nietzsche makes women the spokespersons for his own ideas. Wisdom, and above all life itself, voice his philosophical positions. While Zarathustra's wisdom is courageous, like the warrior to whom she gives her love. As a warrior, Zarathustra wants to promote the struggle for knowledge, obeying the highest thought of life, which consists of overcoming the human being. It's upon Western civilization that he wants to launch his attacks. Zarathustra's wisdom reminds him of life. In the second part of the book, it falls to life to entrust a secret to Zarathustra. In the third part, it is Zarathustra who shares a secret with life. While the first case concerns the concept of will to power, the second could very well have to do with the thought of the eternal recurrence of the same. What's important at this point in our investigation is to underline that the images of the woman which Zarathustra associates with life and wisdom are very different from those which he links with human or to human women. He considers wisdom to be courageous and concerned, sarcastic, violent, fickle, and stubborn. He sees life as captivating, seductive, temptress, and fickle. Rebellious, his wisdom does not submit to established values. A sorceress, life hides gold within her. In contrast, Zarathustra believes that human or to human women are destined for procreation and submissive are made to obey their husbands and look after their children. Therefore, when we compare the way Zarathustra conceives human or to human women and the ones he loves, we can also assert that his ambivalences merely reveal Nietzsche's own ambivalences. In Beyond Good and Evil, taking aim at two adversaries at once, Nietzsche opposes dogmatic philosophy on the one hand, questioning its use of means committed to metaphysical thought, and attacks the movement for women's emancipation on the other, denouncing the behavior which leads women to identify with dogmatic philosophers. He asserts that the woman talks about the woman as such. In other words, the woman as a genus theorizes about the woman as a concept. By seeking their own independence, women present themselves as a genus, which, like any genus, flirts with universality and make use of a concept which, like any concept, purports to apprehend essences. In a word, they resort to means which are committed to dogmatic philosophy. According to Nietzsche, women who attempt to equal men make a miscalculation. Seeking to gain rights, they reduce their sphere of influence. Exercising influence is not compatible with having rights. While rights have to do with the society that was formed after the French Revolution, the influence concerns the society which existed before it. They are two different social orders, and therefore two different ways of thinking, acting, and feeling. Excited by the French Revolution, women have weakened. Both emancipation movement and democratic tendency aim at leveling individuals and as a result are trying to suppress any hierarchical social organization. According to Nietzsche, by fighting for equal rights, the movement for women's emancipation is nothing more than a manifestation of the decadence characteristic of modernity. He understands equality as an imposition of what is uniform, of what is gregarious. He conceives equality as a suppression of differences, an exclusion of exceptions. Believing that, in modern times, thanks to Rousseau and to the French Revolution, the idea of equality became synonymous with gregarious leveling, Nietzsche is eventually led to make it one of his main targets. His attacks on this idea become the argumentative core of his critique of modernity. Nietzsche, a critical thinker of standardization, is by no means ambivalent about emancipated women. Here, we can find no ambivalence. When examined closely, Nietzsche's texts reveal that women authors are the ones who intrigue him the most. That a woman addresses issues that are part of her role as mother and wife, that can be accepted. That she devotes herself occasionally and under the influence of emotion to literature, that can be admitted. That she uses the pen as an ornament that can be tolerated. This is the case of Madame de Lambert or Madame de Remusat. Among Madame de Remusat's writings, we can find memoirs, letters, and a book entitled Essays on Women's Education. And among Madame de Lambert's texts, we can find books on problems relating to education. Nevertheless, this way of thinking contrasts with the attitude that Nietzsche takes in relation to other women authors, like Madame Roland, Madame de Stael, or George Sand. He criticizes them because they intervene in realms of action previously reserved only for men. He states that, I quote, among men, the above named are the free comic women as such, nothing more, because they dared to express themselves publicly about all areas of life, from problems relating to literature and political and social issues, insisting on the idea that women should not express themselves in public about sciences, and even less about philosophy or politics. Nietzsche adheres, in my view, to the position of condemning women to the exclusion that is characteristic of modern philosophy. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Scarlett, for this revealing presentation. And let's now open for discussion. So if you have questions, please write on the chat. And the speakers, please just open your microphones.
Then I dare to do that. It was a great pleasure to hear your very differentiated view of Nietzsche's, let's say, use of women, all different types of women for philosophical purposes. You mentioned at the beginning of your talk, dear Scarlett, that Nietzsche was one of the first philosophers dealing with gender or the sex difference in his philosophical anthropology, while former philosophers were not really so, male philosophers, to emphasize that, were not really so much interested in this difference. I would like to know whether this interest Nietzsche shows has to do with, well, another socio-cultural context, not only the political context of the opposition against the subjection of women, most prominent in Harriet Taylor Mill's and John Stuart Mill's philosophical exposition, but also has it to do with another, let's say, scientific approach to the gender difference. So I would argue, or I would assume, that a male person at the end of the 19th century was able to know much more about the biology and the physiology of women than it was possible, let's say, a century before. So I would like to know whether this interest we know of in natural science, Nietzsche always proves to have, had also an impact on his, let's say, anthropological, philosophical, and anthropological interest in this male-female difference.
I'm sorry. I forgot. Okay. Thank you very much, Andreas, for your questions, your free questions. And I don't think that Nietzsche was the first one to consider the differences, sexual differences, but I don't know. I think that in a certain way, his reflections on this matter is such that he takes really the question of, for instance, women's emancipation, but not only this one, also female images and the construct of images and so on, as one important object of study. It is an important object of study for him, in my view. As I try to make an immanent reading of Nietzsche's texts, I won't have much to say about the influence of biological and physiological researches on the impact of these researches of natural sciences on his writings on women. But I do believe, as in the case of when we approach the idea of decadence, there, for instance, of course, we can find an impact of his readings about natural sciences, and probably, but it's not my subject. I didn't try to contextualize Nietzsche's writings in his time. But on the other hand, concerning Stuart Mill, I was very interested, and I did it, an approach. I tried to compare Stuart Mill's writings on women, especially that one translated by Freud in German, with Nietzsche's own positions. And of course, Nietzsche himself, he criticizes clearly in his texts, especially in Beyond on Good and Evil, Stuart Mill's positions. So I think I stop it.
Thank you very much. Makes it very clear.
I thank you.
We have a question from Emmanuel Salanskis.
Okay, so I'm going to read my question to be as clear as possible for the audience. Thank you very much, Scarlett, for this very stimulating overview of a book which I already know a little because I have read parts of it in French. My question is the following. Does the beginning of the birth of tragedy plays a role in your interpretation of Nietzsche's discourse on the relation between the sexes, especially when Nietzsche says in German, when he compares the battle between the sexes with the conflict between the Apollinian and the Dionysian, in ähnlicher Weise wie die Generation von der Zweiheit der Geschlechter bei fortwährendem Kampfe und nur periodisch eintretender Versöhnung abhängt. So this idea of a recurring conflict between the sexes, which could be compared with the distinction of Apollo and Dionysus.
Thank you, Emmanuel, for your question. No, I did not take into consideration the birth of tragedy from this point of view, but I examine posthumous fragments which are contemporary to the birth of tragedy, where Nietzsche speaks of mainly the viralization, mainly culture, mainly a culture for men, and a culture made, civilization made by men. Yeah. And that's all. But because I think that the birth of a tragedy is not exactly a writing about women. That's why. So I limited myself to the Nietzsche's writings on women, really.
Thank you very much, Scarlett. We have.
I would have a question as well.
Okay. Yeah,
Thank you very much for your talk. I will ask how would you explain the largely absence of acting female figures in Nietzsche's text, especially in Thus Spoke Zarathustra? You have an idea?
I'm sorry, I think I didn't get your question.
Okay.
Because the film in Zarathustra just...
there are no acting female figures in Zarathustra, and I think in Nietzsche's whole work, nearly.
Yes, in Zarathustra we have female personifications of, female personifications of imaginary entities.
Yes.
Female personification of life, wisdom, and eternity, and solitude, and so on. Yeah, but we do not have, yes, Zarathustra never, during all the book, never took a woman as an interlocutor. Of course, we can think of this discourse, this speech, where this speech code on the old and the young women.
Yes, yes. And
but the conditions of possibility of this talk between Zarathustra and the old woman, the conditions of possibility are very clearly. The old woman does not present herself as an interlocutor, and Zarathustra does not take her as an interlocutor. She is too old for that, she says. That's the way I interpret this passage. And I think that's the only one, to my mind, at least now.
Yes, I think it's very interesting that in a former draft, Zarathustra speaks to brothers and sisters, but in the published work, never.
Only brothers.
Yes.
Thank you, Katarina.
So we still have another questions on the chat, but I think we will have to interrupt because we still have other presentations. And well, if Scarlett, if you wanted, you can answer, of course, these questions that arrived directly in the chat. And I would like to thank you very, very much for this incredible presentation.
I thank you. I thank you all. Thank you very much.